Anything funny you want to say before we start?
What's green and sits in the corner?
What's green and sits in the corner?
A naughty frog. Hey guys, welcome back to the Remind podcast. I'm Dr. Ashleigh Moreland. I'm joined by my co-host David Masterton, and today we are answering the question, should I seek an ADHD diagnosis? We are answering this question in the podcast because it is something that I have been asked so many times just in my own professional role, but also I've been seeing it everywhere online. So we thought, let's answer the question that everyone's asking.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about it. So coming from the context of two raging ADHD people.
Love the raging part. That's good.
Yeah.
This is not some sort of vanilla ADHD. This is raging ADHD. Yep.
Yeah. I was actually thinking this morning, like, man, I am such a I describe myself as a highly excitable person, get massive shiny light syndrome. And I love my personality. I recognize that I'm super quirky and I'm not everyone's cup of tea. I'm too much for a lot of people. And I'm okay with that. But for so much of my life, I wasn't. Like for so much of my life, I felt like I was too much and I felt like I was never right. I used to feel like an alien on a planet that I was born in the wrong place. Yeah,
gotcha. I had a very similar experience, probably not shiny light syndrome, but I put the H in ADHD when I was young. It was just like run and energy, and like I remember my parents had a friend over that I got told this story, by the way. I was too young to remember it. My parents' friend brought over a young German Shepherd puppy that was so full of energy. And the friend brought this puppy over and said, I started playing with it, and they said, look, be careful because the puppy has a lot of energy and, probably wear your son out. Anyway, apparently 3 hours later, I was there dragging the puppy along, and it's just there going, I've had enough.
Wow.
I've had enough. So that's the level of H that I had in the ADHD. So can absolutely understand that, because being hyperactive or distracted shiny object syndrome, neurotypical aware society would put that as disruptive or checked out or not ideal. So I get that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it presents differently, particularly between males and females. And I want to talk about this. Obviously, my background is neurophysiology, and I want to talk about this from a neurophysiological perspective to begin with, because to think about some of the signs and symptoms of ADHD largely is all about executive function. And our executive functions are driven by the front part of the brain, things like impulse control, working memory, all of these kinds of things that are super characteristic of tick, 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 tick. Yep, ADHD. But from a neurological perspective, something that's really, really important to keep in mind is that the front part of the brain will switch off essentially and not function when the back survival parts of our brain are activated. So the amygdala in particular, which is kind of like the stress response center that's always searching for threat. And so I find it really interesting that there's so much experience of executive dysfunction everywhere you look at the moment. And this is not to say that these people may not have experienced signs and symptoms of ADHD in their early life. And I find that often when people look back, they'll go, oh my gosh, wow, there were all these signs. So it doesn't take away from that. But what I'd really love for people to understand is that the way that our brain functions is if we are under high stress or we have any kind of unresolved trauma that is causing that amygdala to be hypervigilant of threat in our environment, then we are going to experience the behavioral manifestations of ADHD simply because the front part of the brain is offline. And so
It's like a light switch. It's sort of like it's either switch to the front where you can use your logic, or it's switch to the back, which is survival mode.
That's right.
Just so happens that the thing that's actually in control of that switch is at the back of the brain anyway. You can't think your way out of survival mode.
Yeah, essentially. And I think that this is really important. So we had a whole entire episode on the flight response. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But the flight response when it comes to ADHD is particularly relevant, especially when the symptoms of inattention are present, because the flight response can be a mental flight, not just physical. And so when we kind of check out, when we mentally escape, and it's almost like that level of dissociation. In our home, we call it lights are on, no one's home.
Yep.
That's for me. That's what we say for me, by the way. That's not, being mean to someone else in our household. Lights are on, no one's home. So
it's like that glazed over look in your eye.
Yeah, and that flight kind of behavior of that constant go, constant busy, constant rushing, constant this, that is a survival response. That's actually telling me that the amygdala is hypervigilant and overactive. And so when I look at this, globally, on a global scale, humanity is extremely stressed. And I'm not saying, I'm not discounting that historically there's been world wars and there's been absolutely horrific things that humanity has experienced and endured in the past. What I am saying, though, is the context of what we're navigating now is different to anything that we've ever navigated before, simply because thinking back to COVID, that was an extended period of time. Pretty much every single person was exposed to it. The constant access to media, whether it was radio, TV, anywhere you looked or listened, you were hearing the input of threat, telling you how dangerous it was and the death toll and all this kind of stuff, which is like the equivalent of threat porn to your amygdala. And it was constant. And so we were exposed to that relentlessly for years. So essentially what happens is we kind of as a species have had some adaptive responses in our nervous system that have kind of programmed us for survival in our daily life, even though the threat's not there anymore. And so what that happens is that back part of the brain is hypervigilant, front part of the brain is shut off, and we're seeing this exacerbation of ADHD type symptoms. So back to our original question, should I seek a diagnosis? My response to this generally is there's two reasons why I would be super encouraging for someone to actually pay the money, go through the process of getting a diagnosis. Reason one, do you want to be medicated? Do you want the medication to be able to support physiologically your brain to function differently? And if the answer to that is yes, then having a diagnosis is going to open that door for you. There are a lot of people who say, even if I got a diagnosis, I wouldn't medicate anyway. Okay, that's an important consideration. The only other reason why I would encourage people to get a diagnosis formally is if that diagnosis is going to open doors of accommodations. What I mean by that is like if you're studying and maybe you need some extra time in your exams, or maybe you need to do your exams in a different space, or maybe you need some kind of, special accommodations or support to make your study life more manageable, then having a formal diagnosis is going to open doors, not just study, but workplaces as well. That's a whole different topic for me, because I feel like if we just met people where they're at, we would meet their needs as much as we could without needing them to produce a piece of paper to be willing to support them. But unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. So they're my two big ones. If either of those, you need the formal diagnosis for the accommodations, or you want the door open to medication, then my answer is yes. Outside of those two things, generally, my answer is do a free online self-assessment if you tick the boxes, notice which boxes you tick, because they're the areas where you have some space for some functional improvements in your life. And then, we literally have an entire course on this coming out soon. Everything that we do is based off the mind versus the brain. So we know that there are things that will impact your nervous system regulation, things like your environment, your sensory stimulation, your screen exposure, your sleep quality and quantity, your exposure to certain foods, your gut microbiome. We know that there's a whole heap of these things that will be influencing your nervous system being super, super activated, therefore exacerbating ADHD symptoms. So we have all of those things, but we also have the mind element. And the mind is, what are the things that your mind is perceiving as a threat causing this stress response in your body that are not really a threat? Things like someone doesn't respond to an email, or, what if someone rejects me? Rejection sensitivity is a really big thing in ADHD. So my point is, unless you wanted medication or unless you need those formal accommodations, having an understanding that you are experiencing these symptoms and these characteristics of ADHD, having compassion for yourself, that your nervous system is essentially on fire and perceiving threat all the time, but then actually learning, what can I do to functionally improve? And that's where I feel really, really passionate. Whether we get the diagnosis or not, the label's not going to change our life. What will change our life is actually implementing the tools, the strategies, the healing to regulate our nervous system and become more functional.
So just to wind back to what you were sort of saying before, when we talk about the pandemic, is that when collectively we've all been through such a traumatic time, lockdown, masks, every person that you see, every sneeze is a, people look at
life-threatening threat.
Exactly. That when we're in that heightened state, then at that point in time, the back of the brain is more active regardless, because we're being told there is an invisible threat around us. The only time we see it is when someone's got it. And at that time, when someone's got it, the likelihood of, serious injury or death or, like long COVID, all of that was being perceived as quite high.
Yeah.
And so at that point in time, it's fairly obvious that everyone's sort of in a survival mode. But what's not so obvious is now that everything's opened up, and it is a point in history now that we may not have actually healed that.
No. And I think the really important thing is that people can logically know that it's over. People can logically know that there's no threat. But logic and reasoning happens up here.
It's looking at what happened during COVID that may have been incredibly stressful, the feelings, the emotion, and if there's still
embodiment.
Yeah.
And
if there's something there that still has spikes on it that's inside your body when you think about it, and it feels awkward, or if there's like the experiences that some people have gone through where they're forced into their home. Some people really loved it. Some people were put with people that, the relationship only worked when they didn't have a lot of time together, forced together. And what did that mean? So it's about being able to go, is there anything residual? And so what you're saying is that with that, there's higher instances of people having traits of ADHD because they're still in survival mode versus the fact that even someone in a fully healed state that does have that, we'll say, biological makeup that has ADHD, they're sort of mimicking. So one thing I'd like to say is as well, if you want to get tested, it's there's a healthy reason for getting tested and there's an unhealthy reason for getting tested. I'm seeing the unhealthy reasons of being tested is if you can use it as a label. So when you use it as a label, what I'm getting to is if you're wanting to use it as an excuse for poor behavior. So it's sort of like I'll interrupt you every time you talk because something just pops into my head, right? And then people get annoyed and you go, look, sorry, like I've got ADHD. Okay, so kind of put up with it. Or inattentive, or just wanting to rush around, or just going from one thing to another, not being present in the moment. If you're wanting to look at it and go, I just want to use it as a label or an excuse for this behavior, that's not a healthy way to look at it. If you're wanting to do it to, yes, let people know that this is happening while also looking at ways to improve it, now not in a linear direction. It's sort of like, I have this, I want to be more aware so I can be more compassionate for those around me. They're two different things.
Yeah.
So I found that I was diagnosed pretty early in my life and I chose to ignore it because I was given a label, never medicated. And by God, coming back to it and then realising that there are some significant things, especially emotions and the way I think and the way I talk and all of those things, it starts to make sense to go, okay, I might want to give this part of me a bit more daylight for me to understand what's going on. Because from an ADHD perspective, especially in relationships, like you take someone who's got ADHD in the early stages of a relationship, that absolutely will hyper-focus on the relationship and absolutely just sign and write massive checks about their feelings because they're feeling it, right? They're feeling it. And then suddenly after a while, it starts to come down. Now, what's the difference between an ADHD person doing that versus a narcissist love bombing you? Right? The intention's completely different because for me, I'm following my emotion and I love the up. Absolutely love the up. Right, and everything I'm saying, I'm absolutely meaning, not because of any other reason. It's like I'm saying it because I feel it and I love this feeling and it's intense. And when it's coming down, it's like, what have I done? Oh, God. Versus. And so it's really important to sort of know, okay, but when you've got a third party looking in, oh, he's a narcissist. He love bombed you because he wants to control you. Well, hang on. Okay, yep, they look exactly the same.
Yeah. It's the heart behind it, I guess, the heart and the intent behind it.
That's it. But there's so many similarities. So you've got, as quickly as it goes up, it quickly tapers off.
That's right.
Finds a decent level with an ADHD.
Yeah.
But similar thing with the narcissist. They hook you in and then it comes down and then, so again, from the physical aspects of it. So it's, what I'm trying to get to is having an awareness or an understanding. You might have it, you may not, but when you're on a self-discovery for the purpose of being a better version of yourself, there's no reason to stop being curious, no reason to stop assessing yourself.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
If you're doing it for the label and it's sort of go, well, I want to mask my behaviours because look, this thing says that you need to be more accommodating to me. That's kind of the wrong part because there's a lot that I learned just 7 years ago when I started to really hone in on the ADHD part because I didn't give it any relevance.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And I think it's a really important point that you've made about the behaviours from the outside looking the same. And my dad and I have this conversation quite often. I've spoken about it a lot. My dad, as when I was a kid, was an alcoholic, and we have now got a much better understanding that he probably has a neurodivergent neurotype and has, all kinds of things going on for him. The reason, whatever labels we were to give him now might open up some compassion, might open up some understanding. It doesn't change the fact that at the hands of his behaviours, regardless of the reason, I experienced trauma. And the flow and effects of it, it doesn't delete that.
Exactly.
And so this is what, in our work, this is what we're talking about with clients on a daily basis is helping them to understand, okay, that gives us a lens through which to understand why the behavior is happening. But it doesn't mean that the behavior can continue happening. There are this is our job. Our job is to be able to go, okay, maybe these strategies won't work for you because your brain operates like this, but it doesn't mean to say we don't find the strategy. And so the analogy that I use for this is like, imagine you have a steak sizzling away on a pan, but someone comes along with the label of tongless. Oh, I'm tongless. Oh, well.
Oh, right. So
just how it is. I can't flip the steak. Can't take the steak off the pan because I'm tongless. Okay, well, yes, that's true. You're tongless. But it doesn't mean to say the steak can just stay on the pan forever. But it's not an outcome that is feasible. And so hypothetically, if you were born without tongs, hypothetically, how could you flip the steak?
Yeah, so like navigate the challenges, even though there's a difference
it's
abilities.
Working with the abilities that you have and working with. And so the two-pronged approach is, one, guys, let's regulate your nervous system so that these stress centers at the back of your brain are not so insanely active that the front part of your brain has to switch off. Let's get the front part of your brain back online. That's the first thing. And your symptoms of ADHD, your functional ability to move through life, is going to be drastically different. That's the first thing. But secondly, even for me, I started this show with raging ADHD. That's how I describe it. And I am a functional person with ADHD. I leverage the benefits and I see it as an asset because I know how to work with it. But also something that if you have been ADHD, most of your life, you will realize that you've probably already got some really clever strategies for navigating life. And so with the steak, if I don't have tongs and I was born without tongs to ever flip my steak, well, maybe I use a fork. Maybe I use my fingers and I know just where to put it so that it doesn't burn me. Like maybe I flip it like a pancake, right?
Yep, absolutely.
But the end result of the steak gets flipped is the success. It's not about the how. It's about, and when I was a university lecturer for 12 years and obviously working in more of a science field where if there's ever going to be some neurospicy brains, it's going to be in science or engineering generally. And so I was in more of a science field. And my philosophy was, if you won't learn the way I teach, then I will teach it in a way you can learn it. Understanding that I might have to teach the same thing 10 different ways because people's different brains and the way that they make sense of the world. One person is trying to learn it, like trying to flip it with tongs. One person's trying to use a fork. One person's trying to use the back end of a knife. One person's trying to flip the pan. And so it's up to me to be able to recognize, well, how are all these different people learning so I can support them to use their strategies and their tools in a way that works for them. And I look at that and go, imagine if instead of obsessing over the label and going, well, I can't flip the steak because I don't have tongs. Imagine going, so you weren't not flipping the steak because you were lazy and you were useless and you were, naughty or defiant. That's not what was going on there. You weren't flipping the steak because you didn't have tongs and you didn't know that you had all these other ways available to you to flip it. That's where that compassion and understanding kind of comes in. But then it's what we're really passionate about is supporting people to go, okay, let's work with you and understand how can you achieve that steak being flipped? How do we achieve that outcome given that you don't have tongs? Oh my gosh. All of a sudden, all of these amazing solutions become available to us. So should we get a diagnosis? Maybe, if they're the reasons, medication opening doors. I do find that people have a whole heap of that compassion and understanding when they look back and go, oh my gosh, I wasn't a horrible child. It wasn't because I was dumb. It wasn't because I was naughty. It wasn't because of anything like that. It was because of my brain. behaving in that way or working in that way. So it does open up that whole level of compassion. But I would say to people, don't let the label be the thing that makes your compassion available or not.
Oh, exactly. I mean,
understand your nervous system.
At the end of the day, you are who you are. With or without an ADHD diagnosis, I'm still David. Like, your personality is built up of all of the neurotypical and neurospicy stuff that you've got going on. That doesn't change. It's just sort of bringing it to, like what you sort of said, becoming aware. But I also would say that because there's a whole lot of, I suppose, awareness around it, there is a lot of people who are wondering, do I have it, even though the diagnosis is based on tick boxes of traits.
Yes,
right?
Characteristics.
So if that's the case, then if I tick 1, well, does that mean I'm neurospicy in this direction? Well, no, that's a trait. Like, if you could imagine if someone was devoid of all ADHD traits, it means that there's this massive skew in the other direction. It's sort of like I could probably show a couple of autistic traits. It doesn't mean I'm autistic. However, if I have a larger number of these traits, okay. Because this is what makes up a personality. This is what makes up a human being. So don't get caught up on specific traits that you may have. If you have a large number of them and if you want to become more self-aware, then continue the thing. And again, as you were saying, Ash, if you're not interested in medication or if you don't think that the diagnosis is going to help in any way, well, assume you do. What are you going to change now? Because
what's next?
Yeah. And sort of, okay, would you then say to people, well, I think I have ADHD, so put up with it. Well, not healthy. Or it's sort of like, hey guys, I'm learning to do this, so I do apologize, but I'm trying to become more aware and please sing out if I have these, in the future, and you're working towards it, then that's probably a healthier way to look at it.
Yeah.
But one thing I will say about medication, though, is I was never medicated. And I learnt to cope in healthy and unhealthy ways during my life. And so when William, my son, was diagnosed with ADHD because he has a big old capital H, just like his dad. And so we decided not to medicate because we didn't want to sort of take away his personality. That was kind of like the biggest sort of thought. Anyway, over time, it got to a point where we decided to give it a try. And the interesting thing was being on Ritalin, it allowed him to slow his mind down so his emotions could catch up. And so medication is not a bad thing, but it's also not a silver bullet.
Yeah. To
sort of go, oh, if I have ADHD, this will fix everything. No, it just gives you that headroom, brings down some of the chatter so that to launch off. Reason I know this is because he went through a time he didn't want to take medication. He said it changed him too much. So for the first time, I sat down with him and I took some of his medication to know what he was going through, because I can't just sit there and say, take it. Biggest hypocrite in the world. And I experienced what he was going through. And it was sort of like, it was for me for the first 2 times, because I said I'll do it for him for 3 days. And he reminded me after day 1, hey, Dad. It gives you, like, the best way to describe it, it's a sense of almost, it's a sense of peace and weight, but there's, from the head to the shoulders, it feels like that. However, if there is an anxiety, the anxiety is still at full tilt, sort of like for me in the stomach. However, it was sort of like it was mimicking a sense of complete, just rest, just joyful, just content, connected. But it was like the top half versus the bottom half. So don't be afraid of it, because it's a tool. It's not a forever thing. It doesn't have to be.
And I think so with medication, I'm certainly not against medication. For us, we choose not to use medication because, like I said, we're at a point where we're functional. We're functional in our lives. We leverage the traits that we love. We know how to navigate those more challenging traits. But medication can be life-saving for people, but I would life-changing. But I would say I love what you said, that it's not the silver bullet, because let's say, for example, we medicate, but emotional dysregulation is still a problem, right? A part of emotional regulation is having skills and literally knowing what to do, what to say. Part of nervous system regulation is knowing what to do, what to say, and what medication can't do is teach you those things. And
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really important point. And what I find in our work a lot of the time is that when people actually understand their nervous system and understand how to work with it, how to understand the way that I talk about how our body speaks to us. And when we know how to interpret it, when we know what it's saying and we know how to respond to what it's saying it needs, then that's how we have this beautiful serve and return relationship with our body. We can hear its needs and meet its needs, and hear its needs and meet its needs. And so that is a really beautiful thing. And it's my ability that I've learned in my adult life through, as I said, the nervous system regulation, understanding emotions more, understanding how to process emotions, being able to understand my sensory environment, sensory triggers, and all those kinds of things that makes medication not necessary for me anymore, because my home life is not a sensory freaking hell den anymore that I need to medicate to be able to cope. And so I think that's a really important point. The other thing that I would say, and this is something...
Just before you dive into that part, because you talk about emotional regulation, right? If you're finding that your head's running and then you start taking, or you think the medication's going to help with the emotional regulation, and this is for me anecdotally when I've seen it with William and my niece, is that when the head is running, it is a great way to distract yourself from what you're feeling.
Yes.
So it keeps everything kind of, I won't say in check, that's a bad word, but it kind of keeps it at a level. Now, when both of them have started taking medication, they no longer have that suppression of the head, the activation, especially with William. It was like he was constantly moving and his emotions were like 3 steps behind him. When he took the medication, he stood still and the emotion just went whack, got him. And so it will absolutely hit you right between the eyes of what if you do have this and a busy mind, you start taking medication, there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. Yeah. That emotion's coming up and it's coming up pretty quick.
Yeah.
And it can be a little bit sort of unsettling. However, chances are the reason why, it's like it's a constant feedback loop.
Yeah.
The head's running, creates the emotion's there, the head's running.
Yeah.
And so you start to unpick that apart.
Yeah.
But
I think about it like if the emotion from whether it's unresolved past issues, whether it's even acute emotion that's coming up in response to something that's happening in our daily lives, if that emotion is a 7 out of 10, the head noise has to be at 8 or more to drown it out. Yeah. Whereas when the head noise goes down to a 4, the emotion's still 7.
It's still
so
exactly.
Knowing what to be able to do, first of all, to process the stuff from the past, but second of all, to know what to do in the moment, that self-awareness, and to have the tools and the skills to be able to respond in any given moment, that is so necessary with or without medication.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the second point I was going to make is when you were talking about, the tick boxes, if you go through that list, the diagnostic criteria, and you go, oh, well, I tick that one and that one, but you don't meet the full diagnostic criteria. This is something that enraged me as a researcher because in human research, you have to have cutoff points, right? You have to go, okay, so to be eligible, you need to meet these criteria. And if you don't meet these criteria, well, then you're not eligible for this study. And something that used to really, really pain me was when people were genuinely experiencing challenges in their lives, but because they didn't tick all the boxes, or because they were at 76%, but they needed to be 80 to be in the cutoff to be eligible for the study, then their dysfunction and challenge became invalidated simply because it didn't tick the right boxes or tick enough, right? So I look at it not so much as, you spoke about it as a trait. So when I'm working with people, I'll say to them, what is a trait in your life, or what is something that is making your life harder or negatively affecting your parenting, or negatively impacting your relationships, or making things difficult at work? Like what, even if it's one trait, even if you went to that ADHD assessment and you didn't tick all the boxes, but you ticked 2, I want to know, are the boxes you ticked a problem for you? Because if they are a problem for you and they are making your life more difficult, then invalidating that by saying, oh, no, you didn't tick the boxes, so you're not ADHD, doesn't help your life.
Yeah,
and
true.
So
exactly.
Whether someone ticks 100% of the boxes or whether someone ticks one box, my question is the box that you have ticked a problem for you? And if it is, let's support you so that it's not a problem anymore. So that either we can process whatever needs to be processed, or we can learn the skills, whatever needs to be learned. But let's get you more functional. And this is my point with people when, that they are thinking about a diagnosis. I also had a thought as well that we have definitely gone into this conversation thinking about adults. I would say for children, my considerations are slightly different. One is that a child, for my kids, something I wish I had have thought about is that diagnosis will be on their medical record forever, and we don't know what's going to change in the future. So not having any insight into how that might be weaponized against them, what doors it might close in the future, is something that I personally consider. The other thing is, there's even been conversations about having specific things for people with driving tests if they have ASD or ADHD. Whether anything comes of that, I don't know. But once it's on their official medical record, it's on there. You can't do anything to stop that. Secondly, another consideration for children is that having a diagnosis, particularly not so much ADHD, but particularly ASD, having a diagnosis will open doors to NDIS support. And NDIS support, this is obviously if you're listening from Australia, and that will give you funded access to therapies like occupational therapy, speech therapy, psych, all these kinds of allied health and capacity building supports that for many families at $194 a session is completely out of their budget. So again, it opens doors to accessing support, but slightly different considerations when we're talking about diagnosing kids. But yeah, again, it's about function. That's what our responsive parenting course is all about. When I have people ask me all the time, obviously because we work with behaviour, I have people ask all the time, will you work with my kids? And my answer is always no. And the reason for that is not because we don't want to help kids or we can't help kids, but what I can do with a child in 45 minutes a week is not going to help the other 6 days, 23 hours and 15 minutes. So our approach is if we can educate, equip, upskill, regulate, support the parents or caregivers, then 24 hours, 7 days a week, whenever that
support. Yeah,
exactly. It's like they're living in a therapeutically positive environment rather than just bringing them to an office once a week to that therapeutic environment. So that's why. And all of that is taught in our responsive parenting course. So,
yeah. Well, to test or not to test, that is the question. But it's up to you.
Up to you. Seek support either way.
Exactly.
do the work either way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Chase the awareness, but have the intention of growth as opposed to the intention of label, and you can't really go wrong.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. Well, any comments, let us know down below, and we will see you next week with another Remind podcast.
Our last one before the 100, the big 100.
Yes,
Whoa.
Next week is the last one before the 100. Wow. So anything you want us to talk about in the 100, let us know. And until then, we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.